Let me move to another topic, which means that for a lot of developing countries, when they are looking out, they are seeing there's, of course, democratic model, but there's also other alternative, Chinese model, for instance. Do you think that still pose an attractive alternative for them?
You know, I travel around the world a lot, including a lot to sub-Saharan Africa, and of course to Asia. This is one of 4 Asian societies I'm visiting on this trip. And I look at public opinion survey data a lot, from the Asian barometer, the Afro barometer, the Latino barometer, and so on. And definitely there is some erosion of public confidence in democracy. But 2 things are striking to me. Number one, overt sympathy for authoritarian alternatives remains pretty low almost everywhere. If you ask people, would you like to get rid of your constitution and your parliament and just have a strong personal leader rule? You know, the sympathy for that is rising even in the United States, but it's still a definite minority. Would you rather have the army come back to power in Korea or Argentina or something? God, no. Would you like to have a one-party state? No. Not even in Africa, which is, you know, the area of the world with the lowest levels of education, do you find this. And so that leads to the second point I'd note. There's a lot of interest in the China model. And you know where it is? Among authoritarian rulers who would love to have the China model, because then they don't have to face the danger of a competitive election again, or a free press, or a demanding civil society. So you ask African rulers who have been there 20 or 30 years, or maybe won an election but would rather never have to leave office again, they like the China model a lot. Yeah, and some others who want China's business or so on, but ordinary people do not want to live under authoritarian rule.
Even the China model itself had gone through a lot of change. For instance, the term limits is something that is regarded sacred in the old days. But in March, the president of the country have abolished its term limit. What kind of impact do you think that will have, both inside China and when people in the outside see China, what's that direction China is posing?
Well, let's take the latter part first, because it's the most direct and obvious part of the question to answer. I think interest in the China model has peaked and is beginning to subside because people see how deeply and even ruthlessly authoritarian it is becoming. And one dramatic example of that is Xi Jinping's concentration and personalization of power and evisceration of the progress toward institutionalization that China had been making since the Deng Xiaoping era. That is, reducing the arbitrary power and deification of individual leaders and putting more faith in rules and institutions. Xi Jinping is rapidly and dangerously, I think for the future of the Communist Party, it's a real danger, eroding that. Also, I will say, people are paying attention to what is happening to personal freedom in China. And this social credit system and the rise of the Orwellian state and big data to monitor everything that individuals are doing, and the facial recognition system that we were speaking about before, with cameras everywhere you go in the cities taking pictures of everybody. Who wants to live in this kind of system, where you have no freedom at all, and everything you do is not only being recorded by the government, but being mashed together into some, artificial intelligence algorithm that's going to determine your level of political loyalty to the state. So I think this is really damaging China's reputation abroad. And within China, I think that it may not be visible to a lot of people, but I think China is entering a period in which the stability of Communist Party rule is going to face many more challenges than before. One is you just have to assume, and we are hearing some rumblings deep from, down below the surface, that many elites in the Chinese Communist Party, I'm sure they got to keep their mouths shut right now, or they'll wind up in jail on some alleged corruption charge. But many elites in the Chinese Communist Party, I think, are deeply troubled by this personalization and concentration of arbitrary power by Xi Jinping and the erosion of progress toward institutional rules and rotation of power. Then, in addition, you have the challenges that China is facing as a maturing industrial economy and an aging society. They're now reaping the whirlwind of this one China policy. And their rapidly aging society, labor costs are rising dramatically. A lot of manufacturing is starting to shift to Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Indonesia, and so on, India as well. And they're going to be facing a lot of economic challenges. Their, banking system is way over leveraged. They've lent money to state corporations and city and provincial governments for wild spending sprees and probably to subsidize levels of corruption as well that will lead that have basically created bad debt that can't be repaid. There are a lot of vulnerabilities in the Chinese system. I personally think, and have felt for a while, it's been a harder argument to make, say, over the last 10 years than I think it's going to be to make in the next 10 years. But I have felt for a while that their only way out is serious reform, political reform, to restore the institutionalization in the system and to separate the party from the state and the party from the judiciary so they can really control corruption and get a political economy that can transcend these crony capitalist vulnerabilities. I don't think this is going to happen under Xi Jinping. I'm not sure it is any longer capable of happening under the Chinese Communist Party. But if it doesn't happen, I think there's going to be a crisis that could bring about the downfall of Communist Party rule.
Finally, on Taiwan. You have been visiting Taiwan many times. You witness how Taiwan have achieved democratically in terms of democracy. What worries you at this moment? Is Taiwan had passed the point of irreversibility that Taiwan can no longer go into democratic recession, like you mentioned, or Taiwan is heading into somewhat political polarization that a lot of people are worried?
Well, my principal worries about Taiwan are in relation to the big behemoth across the strait, more than internal. I think the existential threats to Taiwan's democracy emanate from Beijing rather than from Taipei. Nevertheless, let me talk about the internal challenges first, and then I'll come to the geopolitical ones. Taiwan is one of the most liberal democracies in the world, and certainly in Asia. High levels of freedom, probably the freest press in Asia. So congratulations, I hope you can preserve it. I do worry about the levels of polarization in Taiwan. And I worry about an impulse toward political vindictiveness in Taiwan. you know, I have many friends in the DPP, and, you know, I have a lot, as a scholar of democracy, I found the rise of the DPP and its coming to power in 2000, and, you know, the creation of a more level playing field, a more competitive political system, after all they suffered during the dark years of the Dongwai. It's a really inspiring story. But, you know, now that they are comprehensively, monolithically, the majority party, the dominant party, they should stand back, take a deep breath, and say, you know, how do we want to use this power? And I think it's a very dangerous thing to go after the opposition party and go after the incumbent, the most recent incumbent from that party, the most recent incumbent president, without an overwhelmingly compelling case for serious, intentional criminal behavior. And I don't, from what I've heard of the charges against Ma Ying-jeou, for example, I don't really see that. And to, you know, to press charges on technical matters and try and put a former president in jail on that is a very, very, that's an ominous step down the ladder of political polarization and potentially illiberalism. So, I mean, I'm an outsider. I don't know all the details. You know, you kind of wait to have the judicial process work itself out. But this is not the same, this doesn't fall into the same category of grotesque corruption and brazen fraud that led to the prosecution of Chen Shui-bian. And you don't want to get into a Latin American you know, populist situation where every time there's a change of ruling party, the former president is prosecuted and hounded into jail. It's just, it's a very bad precedent to set. So I worry about political polarization and vindictiveness creating a cycle in each direction that could be very unhealthy and just kind of represent a downward spiral. That's the first thing. Second thing, on the internal front, I worry about the growth of pro-independence sentiment. I said this in Hong Kong with respect to the Hong Kong Democrats, including the young people, many of whom I, you know, have very warm personal relations with and tremendous admiration for. And I say it in Taiwan, this is potentially suicidal. Okay, you have a military across a very narrow strait that has relentlessly, for 20 years, since the humiliation they suffered in 1996 in that crisis with the United States and Taiwan, been building up its strength. Just read the Pentagon report that just came out. With the intent of, if necessary, using military force to reunify, in their language, reunify Taiwan with the mainland. You do not want to provoke this rising giant, this next military superpower. You do not, I'm not saying, therefore, go to the negotiating table and surrender preemptively. I'm not saying that either. But I'm just saying Taiwan is going to be in a situation of rising strategic vulnerability for the next 10 to 20 years, probably, until ultimately, maybe it'll happen sooner, maybe it'll happen later. It's going to happen at some point. Political change in China brings down Communist Party rule and ultimately brings in a democratic system that will find some way to reach an accommodation with Taiwan. Until then, you'd better be really cautious, really careful, and avoid provocation. And any talk of independence is provocation. Even, don't think they're not watching what's happening with the textbooks in Taiwan and the writing out of Chinese history. You know, it's just, They see Taiwan engaging in a salami slicing of incremental implementation of permanent separation. And at some point, you never know when the point is going to be, because it's not only dependent on what you're doing, it's dependent on the political situation on the mainland as well. At some point, they may just throw up their hands and say, we've had enough. So that leads to the geopolitical situation of increasingly shifting military balance, not only in terms of the balance between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, Taiwan, but the balance between China and the United States. And so we are going to face, over the next generation, it's one of the most powerful strategic challenges that the United States will face, let alone Taiwan, an enormously delicate and formidable challenge of, on the one hand, not provoking China, and on the other hand, mobilizing enough resolve and enough clever, modernizing, innovative military readiness so that we avoid a tragedy here.
My final question is also regarding relations with China. Taiwan is an open democracy. Just like other open democracy, would it be subject to a totalitarian regime that is hostile to this democracy? Just like the Russia had meddled with the US election, some people in Taiwan are worried that China would somehow try to, in a way, influence or penetrate the Taiwan democratic system through lobby, through financing a certain political party. Do you think that's possible, or is it a concern that we should have?
Well, you use the word would as if it is a theoretical possibility. It would be very surprising to me if the People's Republic of China has not already heavily penetrated Taiwan's society, economy, and possibly even politics. You say fund a certain political party. I just can't imagine that, you'd just be blunt here, that the KMT would be so foolish as to take funding from mainland China. That would be a death sentence for them politically if it were discovered. So I don't think that's the danger. But I think having China, build their ties through United Front Work Department, covert activities in the universities and in civil society, the economy, and so on. Certainly, I mean, you have to assume they're trying to spy on the government in all sorts of ways. So it's a real danger. I think that, and sure, might they try to mimic Russia's techniques by intervening in social media to affect the election campaign? No evidence they've done it yet, but it would not be surprising, right, if they did it. I think rather than the Russian model, though, I would look to what China has already been doing in Australia, in New Zealand. Now we're seeing rising evidence of Chinese sharp power activities in the United States as well to influence our civil society, our media, our politics, particularly trying to use the Chinese diaspora in the United States, as they've tried to do in Australia and New Zealand. Relentless efforts to penetrate, reshape politics and civil society, build friendships of various kinds, but also use those ties to censor criticism of China and of its claims and ambitions over Taiwan, over Tibet, over the South China Sea, and so on and so forth. So I think the bottom line here is that people in Taiwan, in the government, in civil society, in the media, need to be very vigilant. And on the one hand, you don't want to question the loyalty of anyone who might have a more favorable view of rapprochement and engagement and economic ties with the mainland. There are a large number of people in Taiwan who sincerely believe that this is in Taiwan's interest, that it's necessary, and it can be done while defending Taiwan's security. But you need to be alert to penetration efforts. It's not, might they go on? You have to assume they are going on.
Thank you very much, Professor Diamond, for your time and sharing your thought with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
谢谢各位收看，我们下次见。